Global oil prices have surged past $126 a barrel, their highest since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, as tensions between the United States and Iran escalate sharply. At the centre of it all, the Strait of Hormuz, a vital artery for global energy and a strategic lever of power. With the two sides locked in a high-stakes standoff, US President Donald Trump has issued a blunt warning to Tehran on his Truth Social platform, saying it had better get smart soon. Now, this post comes as the status of talks with Iran remains uncertain and as control over energy flows increasingly shapes geopolitical influence. The impact is being felt worldwide. Rising costs, market jitters, and growing uncertainty for billions. And there are fresh concerns about even more volatility ahead. The United Arab Emirates says it plans to withdraw from OPEC, potentially shaking the balance of global oil supply. Meanwhile, a leaked Pentagon assessment suggests it could take up to 6 months to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz if a deal is reached, though the Pentagon insists that report is inaccurate. So where does this go next? Are we looking at a short-term spike or the start of a more profound shift in global energy? And as oil once again becomes a tool of leverage, who stands to gain and who loses in this reshaped balance of power? Christof Rühl is going to help me answer that question. He's a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University in New York. And he's an internationally renowned economist specializing in macroeconomics and energy economics. Christof, thank you so much for talking to us today. So we're seeing Brent crude surging to its highest level since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Just tell us what exactly is behind this sudden spike. What is driving it?
What is driving it is, first of all, what everybody is talking about, namely the disruption which we are seeing in the Straits of Hormuz. If one looks a little bit closer, many people have asked initially after the attacks on Iran started, why the oil price is not reacting much stronger when it moved to 90 and then 100. And there was a question mark, why didn't we see a much stronger reaction initially? The answer is that when this war started, we had a huge amount of inventories in the system. Oil was in excess supply. There was more oil produced than consumed in these days. And there was a huge amount of oil on the water, Russian oil, which couldn't be sold, Iranian oil, which couldn't be sold. There was a massive buildup, in particular in Chinese strategic reserves. Nobody knows how much, but everybody knows it's giant. And there was normal reserves and inventories in Western Europe, in the US and Asia, Japan and Korea. And these inventories are now starting to evaporate. They are starting to be burned through. So initially the worry was not so big because one thought, okay, as long as no production hardware, no production facilities are physically destroyed or damaged, we can just wait until this war is over, use up our inventories, and then the world goes back to normal. Now it turns out the inventories are getting close to empty, and the disruption is far from over. And instead of one blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, we have now two, with the US blocking Iranian oil and Iran blocking the rest of the strait. And so the worries are manifest now. What happens if the disruption shows up in the flows of oil to the consumer? And this is happening right now. And the answer to that one is higher prices. The situation is a very simple one. You have demand and supply balanced in some form. Then supply falls off by 10 million barrels per day. That's 10% of global oil production. A huge, biggest disruption nominal terms ever. And now demand has to follow. How will demand come down if supply doesn't go up anymore? Either because governments will regulate and will tell consumers to drive less, to fly less, or because prices get higher and consumers will choose to fly less and drive less and use less oil. And it seems to be that in the majority of countries, it will be the price who regulates demand. And that will be now a very painful process with big risks to the economy.
I mean, with Brent crude rising to such an extent, we've heard Tehran saying the world should prepare to pay $200 for a barrel of oil. I mean, at what price point does oil become genuinely destabilizing? How far can these prices go?
They can go much further, in particular because if you think of what oil really is, it's not something anybody uses directly. Nobody drinks oil, for example. It is something which is refined into different products. And these products, they go all the way from very heavy fuel oil for heavy trucking and then diesel to oil which is used in airplanes and is much more sophisticated. And what we are seeing is that the different types of refined products are developing very different pricing patterns. And the reason is that some of the refinery capacity is also in the Middle East or in Russia and has been taken out and is blocked from coming to the market. And as a result, things as different as the kerosene for airplanes has gone up tremendously, by almost 200% already. Diesel has gone up by about 150%, but the car gasoline has gone up by much less. And these kind of spreads will determine the economic impact. And unfortunately, it's things like diesel, industrial fuels are the ones which have suffered most so far. And that pattern seeks to continue. So nobody can give you an exact number where it will stop. But it is clear it will stop only if demand has come down to exactly the extent that supply has been diminished. And 10% demand reduction, demand destruction, as they call it, that's a lot.
You mentioned the price of gas, the price of petrol. I want to talk a little bit about how this is affecting people around the world. Let's start by listening to some voices from the US, where gas prices are now way over $4 a gallon. Let's take a listen.
I've known a few people already saying they don't know how they're going to get to work because it's so expensive right now. For me personally, I have family members who are ill and I can't go visit them across the state or up north because it's too expensive right now to drive. With gas almost $5 a gallon, that's just ridiculous.
Gas prices are affecting me because all of a sudden I drive a lot less. I'm fortunate because I'm retired, so I can kind of pick and choose where I go, but at the same time, I look at the cost of everything. Gas prices don't affect just gas prices, it's also the price of groceries, it's the price, of just everything that's in the economy.
So very clear there how this is affecting people's everyday lives. Those people were in the US. Asia, of course, is very vulnerable to the price of oil. People there are really feeling the pinch. Iran is launching an energy conservation campaign. We heard from Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency. He's just warned again that the world is facing a major energy and economic challenge. Do you see things heading towards a global recession here?
It becomes increasingly likely. The longer this disruption takes, the more likely it becomes. There are some issues here worth keeping in mind. One is many people ask the question, so why is it that prices in the US go up if the US now has turned an energy and an oil exporter, which is true. Over the last 15 years, the US has become from the world's largest oil importer to an exporter to shale oil. So the first thing to understand is that this is a global market. If you cut off oil, so it's like the famous bathtub. You cut off supply somewhere, the water level will be affected everywhere. And same with oil markets. You cut it off at one corner, it's a global market, prices will go up everywhere. There is no shelter in geographic diversification. The second thing to understand is many people rightly point out that the world today uses a lot less oil in its economies than it did 50 years ago during the big crises. 50 years ago, in order to produce, just to give you a number, $1,000 worth of global GDP, one needed almost 1 barrel of oil, 158 liters. It's huge for $1,000 of GDP. Now we are down to about half of that, but still it's giant. It's 70 liters, which we use per $1,000 of GDP. But the flip side of this is that oil is used only in areas where it's most productive, so like flying, where it can't be replaced, heavy transport, certain petrochemical processes. It's no longer used much in power generation, where it can be substituted with something else. And that means that the effect of a disruption now is in general is less visible, but it's more effective. It's a little bit like rare earth. Not much of it is being used, but where it is used, it is irreplaceable. And therefore, this is very painful. And this is something which I think the US administration is underestimating. We are now in the situation where there's almost a race. The US hoping to bring Iran to its knees by blocking its oil exports, and Iran hoping to bring the US to its knees by creating a general global recession, which will then be mirrored in the US in the election results there. And it looks to me as if the calculation that Iran collapses tomorrow and the global economy will not is the second huge big miscalculation in that war. The first being that you attack Iran without thinking about what to do with the Strait of Hormuz, and something mind-boggling to oil analysts, but it happened. Now the second miscalculation could be to hope that one can block in the Iranian exports and in the long term force the Iranian economy to its knees without major damage to the global economy. That is almost certainly also a miscalculation. So the answer to your question straightforward is to say yes. It is highly likely and increasingly likely that this high oil prices cause damage. And the answer is simple. The longer it takes, the more the likelihood increases.
I wanted to bring in OPEC, the organization which coordinates and unifies the petroleum policies of member countries. We've had the UAE announcing that it's going to be leaving OPEC. If OPEC loses a producer of the UAE's scale, what does that mean for the organization's ability to manage global supply and, by extension, prices?
At the moment where we have a shortage of oil and a shortage of supplies, it will not be visible. It doesn't make any difference because at the moment the problem is how to get more oil. It will make a difference for OPEC when we are back in normal times where we have, as I said initially, an excess supply of oil. Actually, there is too much oil in the world in terms of what we are able to produce. The disruption we are seeing is not running out of oil. The disruption we are seeing is a disruption of transport. And it's important to understand the motive of the UAE behind leaving OPEC. Most of the discussion now concentrates on because they were more affected by the war than any other country in the region, bar Israel, because they were attacked very heavily by Iran, because they had ongoing disputes with Saudi Arabia, all sorts of short-term considerations here. But there is a long-term strategic reason for the UAE to do what it is doing. And that is that most observers agree that very likely, for the first time ever, global oil demand will reach a plateau or peak and even start to decline in about 10 to 15 years' time. Oil markets have always been growing, and now if that changes, then the whole game of the global oil market will change in a straightforward way. If you have a market which shrinks because oil demand starts to go down, then for any oil exporter, in order to keep at least his export volume stable, he needs to increase market share. By definition, the market gets smaller. You want to sell the same amount in this market. You need to increase the share of the market you have. How do you do this normally? By price competition. So this looks like if we move into an age where oil is not only abundant, but where producers have to compete on price against each other, a race to the bottom. And no cartel, which is not controlling the whole market, and OPEC only controls half of the market, 50%. No cartel can protect its members from that. And in particular, in times like that, the cheap producer will be king. The cheap producers are sitting in the Gulf of Arabia, in the GCC, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. These countries will suffer the most from OPEC having quotas in place. And that's why the UAE left, because they saw the signs. They also knew if they do it right now, there will be no big discussion, there will be no immediate impact. People will be way too busy looking at the Iranian war to take care of what one important OPEC member is doing. By the time that war is over, by the time the damage is repaired, by the time oil returns to excess supply, the UAE will sit outside of this organization, being able to increase its production without being hamstrung by OPEC production quotas. And that's the real reason here.
So where does that leave OPEC? Because, I mean, the world's energy mix is changing, isn't it? It was changing already. Renewables are increasing. So are you saying that gatekeepers like OPEC are essentially going to be relevant and irrelevant in the long term?
One has to be careful. OPEC's death has been announced many times and never happened. But in principle, oil is still the largest fuel of all the fuels, including fossil and non-fossil fuels and renewables in the world by far. But if it is true And one also has to say that global energy markets as a whole have always been growing. We don't have a single commercially traded fuel which has ever declined in absolute terms. Everything has been continuously increasing since the Industrial Revolution. But if it is true that we are close to a situation where peak oil demand occurs, so where oil demand starts to decline, then an organization like OPEC will become obsolete and its members will start to run away from it, because it will be competition on price. And by that, I mean that whoever produces most cheap oil will have the biggest market share. And for that, the UAE will then be well prepared. Whether that happens is, I don't think, a question. You're right, renewables eat more market share. Eventually, those areas where oil is without competition now, like transport, will also be conquered by some other fuel which will provide low carbon alternatives and all of that, as we already see in the case of electric cars. So it's not a question of if it happens, but it's a question of when it happens. When it happens, OPEC will be disappearing.
Let's talk more about renewables. Do you see governments investing more in renewables in order to be more energy resilient, as a result of what is happening right now between America and Iran?
This is actually, especially in Europe, this is a very funny discussion, because if you think back just a few years to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, before that invasion, when you talked about energy in Europe, it was all about climate change and the energy transition. Nothing else really mattered to most participants in the energy discussions. Then Russia attacks Ukraine. All of a sudden, people realized that renewables have an energy security problem too, because of the intermittency problem. Sometimes no wind, sometimes no solar, and no storage capacity for wind and solar power. And suddenly the debate in Europe switched 180 degrees, and it became the important topic for the winter of 21-22 became, where do we get enough oil and coal and gas from in order to avoid the lights going out and in order to let the heating staying on? The very fuels one wanted to eradicate before. And for a while, this was resolved, and fossil fuels really proved how flexible they are in securing energy security in that sense, if it comes to a disruption of other sources, because they can be easily stored. They can be divided down to, from a big industrial facility down to a cigarette lighter, and they can be transported over any border. The sun and the wind cannot be transported over borders other than in the shape of electricity, which is expensive and cumbersome. And now, a few years fast forward, we have a disruption in the fossil market, the oil and gas disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, and the European discussion starts to flip back. Oh, we need more renewables, and we need more domestic supplies. The truth of the matter is, neither of them alone, fossils or renewables, can generate complete energy security. Nothing can generate complete energy security. The answer to solving the problem of energy security is one which Churchill has given 100 years ago, when he said, the answer to the energy security problem lies in diversity, and in diversity alone, meaning you need all of the above, and you need it from many geographic locations. And there's, of course, another problem on the horizon. As the globalization process stalls, and as trades and tariffs and all the wars which we're seeing fragment the globalization of economies, the integration of economies, it becomes harder for countries like European countries who don't have many resources on their own to guarantee that the lights stay on and that driving can be continued. And the task of developing alternatives which can be produced in-house, like renewables, becomes bigger and bigger. But right now, we are not there yet. We cannot switch to renewables 100% because we cannot store these energies.
Talking about diversity, which is what you just mentioned, Trump doesn't believe in diversity, though, does he? He doesn't believe in renewables. He wants to export US oil. Do you see the Iran war in this situation proving to be an advantage to the US? I mean, do you see the US now in the process of becoming one of the world's major oil suppliers?
It already is. The US is the biggest oil producer in the world, and it is starting to become an exporter. This does several things. One thing to really keep in mind is that it is rare that something originates in energy markets and affects the global economy and the global political situation. Usually, energy markets are at the receiving end of politics and the economy. One example is the 70s, which we already mentioned, and one example is now caused by what is called the shale revolution. Within the span of 10, 15 years, America became from the biggest oil importer of the world to an exporter, to something which Trump calls not only energy independent, but energy dominant. And it is true that without this situation, which privileges the US enormously in its dealings with the outside world, we probably would not have a war in Iran right now, because the US would not have dared to cut itself off from supplies to the extent they actually did. It is also true that the current situation must be a flashing alarm sign. All lights must flash red in China. China is still more than before dependent on energy imports, oil, gas, coal, everything. And they can only watch with horror how the US can afford to disrupt that global system, and all they get is small domestic protests, whereas China would be really in trouble if it hadn't these big strategic reserves we mentioned earlier. And thirdly, it is also true that the current American administration is relatively ruthless and simplistic in its thinking, and really believes sort of they can sustain that situation a long time longer, which is true when you only look at fossil fuels, because they have enough, the planet has enough. And you can translate that immediately into a strategic and into a military advantage. That it doesn't function as easily is also something we are seeing now in the direction of Iran being much more resilient than people expect. And the global economy, damaging the global economy will hurt the American economy as well. Damaging global energy markets hurts American energy markets as well, because the world is still interconnected. But this danger, the real danger, is in this continued drive towards fragmentation of the global economy, which we are seeing originating in the US, which is the opposite of healthy, and which is the opposite of boding well for the rest of the world.
So to sum it up, Christof, I mean, do you see this more as a temporary geopolitical shock, or would you say that this war has essentially restructured global energy markets in the long term?
I see it at the moment. We are still on the sort of side of the Rubicon where things can be repaired. If the war would stop tomorrow, if the US would find a way out, which is hard to see other than actually physically invading, we could still return basically to the world we have seen before. Also, if the energy systems changes, it will be in the direction, that will be the immediate lesson, will be more supply diversity, there will be more pipelines in the Middle East, there will be more emphasis in not neglecting bottlenecks. The next one is in the Straits of Malacca in Asia, which will be a need to address before a blockade is repeated, like in Hormuz. And it will be probably to give more weight to renewables, not only because of climate reasons, but also because they make, to some extent, countries less dependent on imports. But autarky is not a good solution. So what I'm trying to say is energy markets are huge, and they are slow-moving beasts. There will be changes coming, but they will be slow. There is a physical impossibility of changing them all of a sudden over the last few years. We have seen that when we tried to carry out this energy transition, which in terms of global markets didn't go very far. The results now will be slower, but change is inevitably but gradual, I would sum it up.
Christof Rühl from the Centre on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christof, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.